Since the beginning of this year, a staggering 1,448 people have been killed, 1,145 injured, and 1,005 people kidnapped by gangs. And remember that behind each of these numbers are entire families and communities that are torn apart by the violence. Gang members are also using sexual violence to instill fear and exert control over the population. It's in fact reported by my office on the ground in October. This is a multifaceted and protracted crisis, but solutions exist. They require political courage and responsibility at a national and international level. The root causes of this crisis, especially social inequalities, rampant corruption, collusion between powerful elites and gang leaders, and endemic impunity, must be addressed. It's unconscionable that there are people benefiting from this endemic insecurity and the suffering of Haitians. The recent Security Council sanctions regime and the targeted arms embargo against members of Haiti's economic and political elites who reportedly support these gangs, financially and operationally, send a very strong message to those that threaten Haiti's peace, security, and stability. I call on states to ensure that all those who wish to seek asylum have access to fair and efficient asylum procedures because of the state of this country. Yemen, another one. The seemingly interminable conflict must be brought to an end. The truce needs to be renewed. It needs to be expanded to enable discussions on a path towards a more comprehensive settlement. While large-scale hostilities and airstrikes have generally stopped, we continue receiving reports of civilian casualties, especially of children near the front line, due to landmines and other explosive remnants of war. Also of concern are allegations of gross human rights violations, including torture, arbitrary detention, trafficking, extortion, and sexual abuse of people fleeing to other countries. The work of humanitarian actors must continue unhindered and their freedom of movement ensured. And Afghanistan, where the continued systematic exclusion of women and girls from virtually all aspects of life is unparalleled in this world. It deprives the country as a whole of the benefit of the significant contributions that women and girls make. I also deplore the continued use of corporal and capital punishment, including the most recent instances of lashings and executions carried out in public this month. They are in flagrant violations of Afghanistan's international human rights obligations. I urge the de facto authorities to establish an immediate moratorium on future executions and to abolish the death penalty. 5 years after the start of the conflict in northern Mozambique, in Cabo Delgado, civilians continue to be killed and subjected to sexual violence, abductions, enforced disappearances, with ongoing destruction of property, including schools, health centers, and places of worship. Almost 1 million people have been displaced, more than half of them are children. Addressing the root causes of the conflict will require protecting economic and social rights, preserving civic space, ensuring access to justice, and prioritizing young people and women in socioeconomic development and decision-making, including, and that's very important in this context, on the use of natural resources that directly affect their lives. And then there is Somalia, which faces a humanitarian catastrophe among the longest and most severe drought in recent history. I mean, they have had droughts in the past, not more than 3 years, 2 to 3 years. Now we are in the 4th year and beyond. My office has documented a steep rise in civilian casualties, 76% of which are attributed to Al-Shabaab. The recorded casualties from January to November this year, 672 people killed, 1,082 people injured, are 51% higher than those during the same period last year. Serious human rights concerns also include the arrest and detention of journalists, hindering of, as you can imagine, freedom of expression, the fostering of self-censorship, and aggravating pre-existing human rights vulnerabilities. Protecting human rights is a key component of humanitarian action. These and many other crisis situations that have faded from the headlines not only have severe consequences for the people that are directly affected, but are likely to have ripple effects across borders and risk further destabilizing their regions. One thing they and so many other crises have in common is this disregard for human rights. They are marked and sometimes triggered by interlocking human rights violations. To name only a few: persistent racial and other forms of discrimination, violent crackdowns on dissent, violations of the right to an adequate standard of living, and as we are seeing now across each region, a cost of living crisis that is leaving many not knowing how they will survive from one day to the next. Hate speech, including in unregulated digital environments, is only further contributing to setting back rights such as gender equality, and there we have seen a big pushback. The brunt of the impact of these crises is always borne by the most marginalized, the most excluded among those, in particular women, children, migrants, indigenous peoples, internally displaced people, people with disabilities, older people, ethnic, racial minorities, LGBTIQ+ people. And globally, we are also seeing a crisis of trust. The rise in social movements and protests across all regions is a clear sign of the corrosiveness that institutions have inherent in them, despite the fact that they are supposed to serve people. The world cannot afford for its leaders to consider human rights only as an afterthought, or worse, an instrument of geopolitics. What greater lesson did we glean from COVID-19 and the climate emergency than just how interdependent we truly are? That's really the big lesson. That we must come together to protect our shared human rights values and our shared humanity. So I'm launching the UDHR 75 initiative, Universal Declaration of Human Rights at 75, as an opportunity to recall the consensus this declaration envisaged, to reset and strengthen the remarkable human rights infrastructure we have constructed, to rekindle the spirit, the impulse, the vitality that forged the Universal Declaration 75 years ago, and to rejuvenate a worldwide consensus on human rights, one that unifies us in the face of the many challenges that we have. This initiative will be coordinated by my office together with partners. It will involve activities and actions, including ways to renew people's awareness of and commitment to human rights, especially among young people. And we are going to be finding ways to think in new and innovative manners about human rights challenges. Written and adopted by representatives from all regions of the world, the Universal Declaration makes it clear human rights are universal and indivisible, and human rights are the foundation for peace and development. UDHR 75 provides us with an opportunity for unity and hope that mobilizes the world for the cause of human rights, and that sets us on a path towards a better future that is based on justice and equality for all. Thank you.
Thank you, High Commissioner. I've got any questions in the room? Okay, we've got 2 questions in the room and we've got 3 online. So we'll start in the room. Please, of course, introduce yourself and the media that you represent.
Stéphane Bussard, Le Temps newspaper. Thank you, High Commissioner, for holding this briefing. I have a question about Ukraine. How do you look on the current situation with civilians being bombed constantly, and how do you qualify, or how would you qualify what's going on in terms of human rights? We know that there are a lot of investigations going on, talking about possible war crimes, crimes against humanity, or even some talk about genocide. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Laurent. Christophe? Sorry, I forgot to mention that we will take 3 questions at a time, please, to allow as many of you to ask as possible.
Okay, my question comes back to what you said on hate speech. We recently had a former US president and now candidate for the next election having dinner with a white supremacist. And just a few days after that, one of the most well-known musicians in the world told the world about his love for Hitler and the Nazis. So I was just wondering what your opinion was on that, and what you think about this kind of speech seemingly coming out in public with much ease. Thank you.
Thanks, Christophe. Online, we've got Laurent Sierot. Could you please unmute?
Yeah, thank you for taking my question. Can you hear me? I'm stuck in the station, so I hope you can hear me.
Yes, we hear you very well, Laurent. Could you please
Thank you.
introduce the agency that you work for as well?
Yeah, sure. Hi, Commissioner. Laurent Sierot, Swiss News Agency. Yesterday, there was the first execution in Iran of one of the protesters. What's your reaction to that? And very quickly, I'd like to come back to the incident in Ukraine that you were confronted to having to meet people in a shelter. Did Russia know about your program and your program there? And I can assume that they know. So what does that incident tell us when a high-ranking UN official is visiting a town which is bombed by a P5 member? Thank you.
Thank you, Laurent. High Commissioner, please.
Look, on the situation in Ukraine, I mean, it is a human rights emergency. I mean, if you look at just the figures speak for themselves. You have 17 points. I mean, it's about, the population is about 42 million people, right? So you have 17.7 million in need of humanitarian assistance. You have 9.3 million requiring food and livelihood assistance. A third, you have about 7.4 million refugees. You have 6.5 million people internally displaced. I mean, if I look at we traveled through the country, as you know, we were both in Kyiv, we went to Bucha and Irpin, and then traveled on a night train to Kharkiv to the east, and to Izum, which is about 40 kilometers away from the front line, which were recently liberated. I mean, what you see is a country that is suffering from not only the missile attacks that happened on Monday, and this is not the first time, as you know, that started in October. In fact, one of my first public statements was about that. It destroys civilian infrastructure. As a result, the energy sector is heavily affected, the heating system, the electricity grid. There are people who live in sub-zero temperatures without heating and without electricity. There are these blackouts, so you can imagine, and these are millions of people who suffer this every day. So I mean, it's clear it's a human rights situation that affects, and a humanitarian situation that affects large, not the whole country, large populations in the country. We also issued on Wednesday a report that my office had prepared after the incidents in particular in the north part. And just to mention, because I was in Bucha, which at the time attracted a lot of media interest, we had our colleagues had done a detailed inquiry into these killings that happened, and it's about 441, if I'm not mistaken, 441 killings that included summary executions, willful killing of civilians. It included torture, and this is just when it comes to Bucha. The documented ones were 441. We are still looking into about up to 200 other cases. And yes, this, you can imagine, also has huge impact on the loved ones, on the people that survived this. I saw myself pictures of, you know, a man with a sack of potatoes who just went out to find it, and I mean, in order to probably bring it home to cook, was shot dead, right? So that shows an incredible situation. And in all those areas, in Izum and everywhere else, I mean, not to the same extent, the scale and the measure are not the same as in Bucha, but at the same time, we see the similar picture of enforced disappearances, summary executions, people who get killed as civilians, and the impact that it has on those, especially when civilian infrastructure gets hit. It has immediately impact on people's livelihoods and getting on with their lives, especially during a winter period. So yes, it's a very serious human rights situation for the world. Not to speak about the impact that the crisis has on other countries. I was in Moldova yesterday. I mean, Moldova suffered blackouts as well because of their dependence on energy. They have 94,000 refugees from Ukraine that are actually staying and in host communities with a population of over 2 million. So again, it shows the impact. And as you know, the impact on countries in the global south, especially when it comes to food insecurity, energy, and the financing of it is equally disastrous. So it's a war that has global implications. On hate speech. Well, I mean, if there's one thing that we all have to be very vigilant about, it is indeed the dehumanizing of the other. I mean, any situation that I've been confronted with, not just as High Commissioner for Human Rights, but also before in my work as in UNHCR, has always, I mean, I've talked to so many people, thousands of people over the years, where they tell me stories about how they were not seen as the other, how their human dignity was taken away from them. So we have to be very vigilant. And there is a particular responsibility for those who are in political leadership positions. They are often the ones who fan the waves of hatred, and they have a particular responsibility to avoid that. So I think it is absolutely clear that countering hate speech is incredibly important. And you probably saw my open letter to Elon Musk, where one of the elements, it was a couple of considerations that I mentioned in relation to human rights and social media platforms, because especially when it comes to social media platforms that have an ability to amplify and disseminate very quickly the type of speech, including hate speech. We have seen this also in Myanmar, for example, and in Ethiopia, where they have a particular responsibility to make sure that hate speech does not get disseminated. The same is about disinformation. So yes, we need to be very, very conscious of this and be very mindful of it. And there is a special responsibility, including from a human rights perspective, when it comes to countering hate speech. Yes, you probably saw we issued a tweet yesterday about the execution. Sorry, about the execution of Mohsen Shekari. Very troubling and clearly designed to send a chilling effect to the rest of the protesters. We will follow up with the authorities as well about this. And I can only, as I mentioned during my statement, call on the authorities to immediately institute a moratorium on death penalty, to release the ones who were arrested in connection with the protests, and to work towards the abolition of the death penalty. And then look, I mean, there is a war in the country, and what I experienced was what a lot of the colleagues told me they experience on a regular basis. And they actually mentioned to me, for us, this has become normal that we go into bunkers and shelters when the air sirens start. So it's something that happens to them on a regular basis. It happened to me because and to my colleagues when we were there. but it is what it is in a war situation. I don't read into this anything but an ongoing war that has to stop. But and I feel for the people who have to do this on a regular basis and who don't know what's going to happen to them when they get out of the shelter. And I feel for them also because what they told me is that it has become normal for them, but that's an absolutely abnormal situation, and such things shouldn't become normal.
Thank you, High Commissioner. We have Jamil, Isabel, and then Emma online, and then we'll come back to the room. Jamil, please unmute.
Yes, can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you well.
Yes, thank you, Rabina. My name is Jamil Shade, journalist from Brazil. High Commissioner, thank you for organizing this press conference. My question is about Brazil specifically. The end of Bolsonaro's government is revealing a dismantling of the human rights institutions in the country and gross violations in many ways, in many sectors. My question to you, first of all, what do you make of the last 4 years in terms of human rights protections in Brazil? And what are the challenges for the next government? Thank you very much.
Thanks, Jamil. Isabel Sacco. Unmute Isabel, please.
Yes, good morning. Thank you very much. My question is on Haiti, and it has 3 parts because I think really the dramatic situation there deserves it. Firstly is I would like you to develop on the sanctions that would be enforced from January. From your point of view, what would this change in terms of improving the situation there? Secondly, what do you think about the deployment of peacekeeping forces in Haiti? Is this an idea that could also improve the situation or not? And if you can say something or explain the situation, what you know about the extent of the sexual violence in Haiti. Thank you.
Thanks, Isabel. Emma Farge, please unmute.
Good morning. Thank you so much for your engagement with the press. I wanted to ask about China, if I may. I'm wondering how you personally plan to follow up on the Xinjiang report. The Chinese ambassador told the press corps in Geneva that they decided to close the door on cooperation after the publication. Do you think they can be brought back to the table? Maybe they have already. And also, what's your advice to members on follow-up on this issue in the council, given how divisive it proved to be in October? Thank you.
Thanks very much. High Commissioner.
The cold weather in Ukraine has hit me. On Brazil, the situation is such where, and it's clear that there is a call for a renewal of the social contract between the people and the institutions that are supposed to serve them. Sometimes what we see in this type of circumstances is really a strong emphasis on restoring the support for democratic institutions and really an increase in public policies that increase trust and participation and inclusion. And I think that's very, very important in the context of Brazil. And also looking at what has happened over the last couple of years in terms of some of the structural issues of inequalities, even issues around protection of indigenous communities, but also the safety of journalists and social and political participation. So if you were to give it one particular term, I would say it's a strong emphasis on the renewal of the social contract anchored in human rights, because human rights at the end of the day decide how a social contract has to be renewed or can be renewed under these circumstances. And I think that's really a big challenge for the new government. On Haiti, I mentioned it specifically in my statement because one of the big root causes has always been the control of these gangs by people who have financial and political interests in keeping them alive. So finally looking at them and specifically targeting them, including through an arms embargo, is incredibly important. So I really hope that this will actually do the trick, and it's important because otherwise we keep having an intractable, protracted situation without any solutions in sight. And as a result, it is important that the root cause, or one of the root causes, is addressed decisively. On deployment of peacekeepers, I mean, you probably saw the suggestion from the Secretary General was actually to have a reinforcement of the police. I mean, and that's where I mean, you know, peacekeeping troops is something else. It doesn't quite apply in these situations. What is much more important is to ensure that the Haitian police can exercise its functions of ensuring security for its citizens. And there was a call by the Secretary General in his letter to the Security Council to do precisely that, actually to support the police forces through an international support system. On sexual violence, we issued this report, and I mean, what my colleagues have come back with is precisely that it's a way to control the territory, to control, I mean, by the gangs, and to exert pressure on the population and to show that, you know, they are in charge in a horrible way. So it's one of those degradations, I mean, deteriorations that we see when it comes to these very chaotic, anarchic situations, and sexual violence is an additional factor that is very chilling for the population, and one that really needs to be countered. And I hope that through these decisions by the Security Council that this will be addressed. On China, I mean, the report that was issued on the 31st of August is a very important one. It has highlighted very serious human rights concerns, and my focus is on following up on the recommendations that are contained in the report. And for me, it is also very key, and you know, that of course we will, and I will personally continue engaging with the authorities. And you know, I believe I'm very determined to do so. Hope springs eternal for changes. That's what I can say.
Thank you, High Commissioner. We have Catherine Fiontin online, and then a question in the room, and then Frank Jordan's. I'm not sure we'll have time for more questions after that, but let's see. Catherine, please go on.
Thank you, Ravina. Good morning, High Commissioner, and thank you so much for engaging with the press again. My question is related to Africa, particularly to DRC. The EU renewed restrictive measures and added 8 names to the list of those subjected to restrictive measures. But do you really think that these kind of measures are useful, as we know that DRC is under increasing violence since the late 90s, and we assist to a lot of people arbitrarily arrested and forgotten in jail? What is, according to you, the solution to be implemented? And do you plan to meet the president of DRC or different high-level persons in order to discuss the situation? Thank you so much.
Philippe Motard, the Geneva Observer. I'm going to take you away for a few minutes, if I may. Thank you for briefing us away from the news and going back to the 75th anniversary. If you could add or change anything to the declaration, add rather, what would it be?
Frank Jordans, please.
Frank Jordans from the AP News Agency. Mr. Turk, we've seen in recent months how some climate activists have stepped up protests with direct actions such as blocking roads and airline traffic. And there have been calls to crack down on such protests with a recent fairly strong conviction in Australia. At the same time, there have been landmark cases in European courts that have ruled that insufficient action to tackle climate change is a threat to the human rights of future generations. And I'm wondering where you see the balance there between the sort of direct actions that young people are taking and the future that they may face if sufficient action by governments isn't achieved.
No, thank you. I mean, on the Democratic Republic of Congo, I mean, it's obviously very, very concerning. And I am deeply concerned about the situation, especially when it comes to the exercise of democratic freedoms in the country, but also really appalled by the mass killings of more than 130 civilians by the M23 in Kisheshe and Bondo in the North Kivu province. I mean, the situation is one that requires international attention. We also for 23, it is on my list of countries to visit, and it's clear that we must make sure that DRC remains on the agenda, especially from a human rights perspective. It's very important for us, and also really an urge to ending this fighting that happens in different parts of the country. In particular North Kivu, and we know it's always the civilians that suffer as a result of that. On the UDHR, I mean, if you read the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, and it's really, I would really recommend it to you, you will see that this is a very comprehensive text. And I keep saying it, it's a miraculous text. And it was written and developed by people that in the wake of these two world wars and what happened in between in terms of tyranny, authoritarianism, fascism, neo-Nazism, and all the consequences that it had, Holocaust, genocide, and so forth. So and that's what was in the mind of the people who wrote it. And it talks about economic, social, and cultural rights, and it talks about civil and political rights. And it makes it absolutely clear that these rights are indivisible, that you cannot have prioritization of one against the other. And I think that's something that really came out and was born out of this experience from the past. I can only hope that young people today, that political leaders read that text again and remember it. And remember it not as something that, is a relic of the past, but is actually kicking alive very much in today's context, because it has informed the whole human rights architecture that was developed over the years, but it has also and gives us answer to current problems and future problems. I mean, if you look at the text, in particular, some of the big challenges that we face today, it provides the principles and the values that should address the digital side, the social media platforms, neurotechnology. I mean, talking about artificial intelligence, human agency. So I would very much see it as a very inspiring document that informs not just the challenges that we face and of our present generation, but also, if we interpret it for the future, gives us the spirit and the commitments to address the future challenges. So I would not change anything. I would leave it as it is and interpret it in light current and future circumstances, and use that very much as the element for what we need. But I would also, I mean, I really hope that we rekindle, that we rejuvenate this enthusiasm that the world had when it was written, and that we come back to it as a text that informs governance, that informs interaction between people and among communities, and that actually projects us to the future as well. On climate activism, I mean, without young people, frankly, I don't think we would be, I mean, we are not, when it comes to climate change and how to address it and climate action, we are not anywhere close to where we should be, as you know. I mean, COP27, at least on loss and damage, had considerable, we have made progress there, but we are still not on, I mean, we still have the climate ambition to reduce the emissions to ensure that it's only going to be 1.5 Celsius warming. There's still a lot of work to be done. We wouldn't be even there if we hadn't had young people essentially mobilizing a social movement. And so it is so incredibly important that young people in particular, but frankly, all of us collectively realize how important this challenge is. It's the biggest challenge of our times. It is a human rights challenge, first and foremost, because it affects the enjoyment of all rights. It was fantastic that this year, last year the Human Rights Council, but this year the General Assembly adopted a resolution on the right to a healthy, a safe and sustainable environment. It's also important that a number of the cases that you mentioned, the landmark cases in Germany, in the Netherlands, also in Strasbourg, enlarge the thinking and look at human rights law in light of climate change and climate action, and actually project precisely the type of innovative thinking that we need. And it is really about intergenerational justice. Let's not forget that as well. It is about what do our actions that we are deciding today, what type of impact does it have on future generations? And I think we should all be eternally grateful to the young people that mobilize, that advocate, that make us aware of what in fact their lives are gonna be if we are not taking action today. I mean, it's a huge issue of intergenerational justice, and we should make sure that the civic space for them is protected and safeguarded and not cracked down in a way that we have seen in many parts of the world.
Thank you, High Commissioner. With your permission, we had 2 questions online, but the hands are not now down. I'll just check if they would still like to ask the questions. We do have the High Commissioner will be speaking at the Human Rights Council organizational meeting shortly, so we do need to wrap up. Bodhi, your hand is back up. Good to see it. Please go ahead. Bodhi, please unmute.
Yeah, I'm sorry. Have you heard me? Thank you. My question is simple: that will you follow up on some individual cases of journalist rights in Saudi Arabia? And what will happen in Iran faced to many defenders and demonstrators? What is your suggestions to give to those countries' leaders on the Human Rights Day? Thank you.
Sorry, Bodhi, the first part of your question didn't come out very clearly. Would you mind just re-asking?
Yeah, sure. Will you follow up some individual cases of journalist rights in Saudi Arabia?
Thank you, Bodhi, that came through. Tamer, you had your hand up as well, and it's down now. Would you still like to ask a question? Your hand is back up. Please go ahead, Tamer.
Yes, thank you very much for taking my question. My question is regarding the Muslim community in Europe. Where are the rights of the Muslim community in Europe on your agenda? We are speaking about 50 million persons who are suffering from different types of discriminations in Europe. Are you in contact with the European community about that, or individual European countries? Thank you.
Thank you, Tamer. And just to let the High Commissioner know, Tamer is with the Kuwait News Agency.
Look, we follow up. I mean, as I mentioned before, the safety of journalists and the protection of journalists is a priority for us. And I certainly made that very clear. We have a very strong program with UNESCO to ensure the safety and protection of journalists. It's clear that independent evidence-based media is absolutely critical. And I saw that also in the context of Ukraine, but also in many other situations around the world. You are part of an incredibly important work. And for us in the human rights side, we follow up as a matter of course when it comes to journalists that are either detained or end up in arbitrarily detained or end up in a difficult situation. So that's part of our work. On the leadership, I would say to each and every leader today, please read the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and embrace it and think about it and use it in finding solutions to the big challenges that we face. It's worth it. And I mean, that's really my big call today for all leaders around the world. Please read the UDHR and think of it as your obligation to act. On Muslim communities, both in Europe and elsewhere, I mean, we obviously have a very, very strong program on any discrimination based on any reasons, be it religion, be it race, be it sexual orientation and gender identity. And we will always call out wherever it happens, any discrimination or hate speech that is directed at one particular group, including, of course, I mean, Islamophobia is an issue. We need to address it firmly. And it is part of, unfortunately, a tendency to dehumanize, and we need to be very, very vigilant about it. And our very strong call is to everyone around the world to make sure that this type of speech is countered and that we make sure that people are not discriminated against on the basis of their religion or culture or any other reason for that matter. Thank you.
Thank you very much, everyone. And if I may extend the High Commissioner's request, maybe you all want to read the Universal Declaration of Human Rights today as well. Thank you very much. Bye.
Recording stopped.